Welcome back. I'm the Book Guy, and today we're talking about The Hunger Games. This is part of my monthly theme of YA January, looking at young adult books that you might like to read. Now, it's been a few years since The Hunger Games hype was at its peak, but this series has aged like fine wine. It's more relevant than ever. Put it this way, I read the prequel just last week, anticipating for doing this video next week. I ended up getting sucked in and rereading the entire trilogy in a frenzy, and then changing my YouTube schedule to doing the video today, and then rewatching the first movie. I'm on a massive Hunger Games high right now. Look at my hair, right? Confession, I spent about half an hour trying to do this hair and then gave up and asked my wife to do it for me. She's much better at it. Doesn't it look fantastic? So if you've never read these books, or if you haven't read them in the last decade, let's see if they're worth reading now. This video will be a little bit different. Normally I introduce these books to you like it's your first time. However, this concept is pretty familiar at this stage, so I'll talk a little bit more about dystopian fiction itself, include a few more spoilers than normal, and I'll also talk in retrospect about the hype that was and how Hunger Games changed the YA genre. Let's go. Okay, you know this concept. And so do I. In the ruins of North America, the capital rules over 12 districts. To keep them in line, they have the Hunger Games, a reality TV show and sports challenge where children fight to the death, all for people's amusement. It's government propaganda masquerading as entertainment. Katniss Everdeen cares for her little sister Prim, after her father was killed in a mining accident and her mother succumbs to debilitating depression. Katniss fights to keep her family alive amidst terrible poverty. When Prim is selected as tribute for the Hunger Games, Katniss volunteers to take her place. She has to woo the crowd and please the audience, playing along with this sick fantasy in order to win enough supporters to survive. The author herself, Suzanne Collins, worked as a children's television author for 19 years. Her writer's resume is huge. She has a ton of credits to her name. She mostly worked for Nickelodeon on dozens of their shows, and was even the head writer for a show, Clifford's Puppy Days. One day she had a chance encounter on set with a children's book author, and the conversation inspired her to try her own hand at writing children's books. Her first book is Gregor the Overlander. This became a 5-book series known as the Underland Chronicles. The idea came from Alice in Wonderland, except it's an 11-year-old boy, Gregor, who falls down a manhole, and instead of a tea party, he finds a subterranean area where humans are at war with rats. This series genuinely became a bestseller in its own right. Personally, I'd never heard of it until I was researching this video. Let me know if you've read this one, I'm curious about it. Then one day, Suzanne Collins was channel surfing while half asleep. She saw a reality TV show where young people were competing for money. Then she switched over to the war in Iraq, where soldiers about the same age as the contestants in the last show were fighting a war. In her tired state, these two stories became one, and the idea for the Hunger Games was born. This series is literally the only time Suzanne Collins has written for an audience older than children. She took what she knew about television and reality shows and turned it into a much darker dystopian setting. Another relevant piece of background information, Suzanne's father was a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force. He fought in the Korean War and the Vietnam War. So Suzanne moved around all through her childhood whenever her father was deployed. So Suzanne was uniquely situated to write this story. She had seen someone going to war and heard their personal stories. She had seen news all of her life and worked in reality TV. So she understood very clearly how TV can show a version of reality or a version of the truth, and how that can be different to someone's personal experience. TV can make us feel detached from other people's suffering. That's exactly what The Hunger Games is all about. In researching this video, I found a statement by Suzanne Collins where she posed the question, what would I like young readers to take away from the Hunger Games trilogy? And her answers were so damn near perfect, I'm going to quote them for you today verbatim. She said, questions about how elements of the book would be relevant to their own lives. Like, how do you feel about how some people take their next meal for granted when so many other people are starving in the world? What do you think about the choices your government, past and present, or other governments around the world are making? What's your relationship to reality TV versus your relationship to the news? And was there anything in the book that disturbed you because it related to aspects of your own life? And if so, what can you do about it? And this is something I appreciate about the author and this series. She's not telling us what to think, she's telling us to ask questions. The world building of the series is the perfect dystopia. So quick definition, utopia is a paradise. Dystopia is a paradise with a very serious problem. Okay, so dystopia is not just the opposite of paradise, it's not hell to their heaven. It's a society that seems to function perfectly well on the surface, but actually has something much darker going on. The best way to tell a dystopian story is to take something that exists right now in the real world and take it just a few steps further. In The Hunger Games, it takes reality TV and the news and shows how the two can be blended together to create propaganda, and how entertainment can dehumanize other people for our own enjoyment. Dystopia is not a new genre. It's been around for centuries. Time for some academia. Dystopia fiction is a subgenre of science fiction. Now, many people credit H.G. Wells and Jules Verne for popularizing sci-fi, but its invention largely comes from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And guess what? Frankenstein is absolutely a type of dystopia story. Science is used to create life, and then that creation becomes a monster that kills everyone important to its creator. Sci-fi has had dystopian elements from the very beginning. A major benchmark in dystopia history is George Orwell's 1984. Written partially during World War II and published in 1949, George created a world that had only 3 countries. Now, I'm massively oversimplifying this, but there is basically communist country, fascist country, and democracy country. And yet all 3 are violently opposed to the spread of information and ideas regarding the other countries' philosophies. This book discussed the dangers of totalitarianism, total government control. Although, side note, there is an audiobook version of 1984 narrated by Stephen Fry, who is widely considered one of the best narrators in the industry. That's a good way to enjoy that book if you want to check it out. The dystopian genre has dealt out some big name books, including Fahrenheit 451, The Handmaid's Tale. Dystopia has been active for decades, yet it peaked in popularity about 15 years ago, where the YA trend gave us very quickly The Hunger Games, Maze Runner, and Divergent, all 3 of which were YA book trilogies that became bestsellers and got big movie deals. By the end of this trend, we were all collectively a bit sick of dystopia.
Shut up! Shut up! Oh my God! Shut up!
And I think the genre on a whole has left a bit of a bad taste in our mouths. Part of the problem is the publishing and film industries milked that cash cow for all it was worth. All that corporate greed became its own type of dystopia.
Oh my God. I am part of the problem.
The other problem is Divergent, which tried so hard to be dystopian and wildly misunderstood the concept. But that's another whole video. The short version is that The Hunger Games was the only one of these big 3 to really achieve critical acclaim. Look at these ratings and stats. So The Hunger Games books outscored Maze Runner and Divergent, and the same happened for the movie versions as well. This is why I still think The Hunger Games is worth reading today and holds up incredibly well, because I believe it is the best dystopia. The main trilogy of these books is only about 400 pages each, or in audiobook form it's less than 11 hours. So these are very quick reads, and easy for someone who's out of reading practice. This is perfect for young adults. The plot has incredible pacing. There is always something major happening in every chapter. This series does not waste time or pages. It goes from set piece to set piece with barely any time in between. There were times when I felt like it moved too quick. But then I've read Malazan, so if I think it was too quick, it probably means it was just right for new readers. In the first half of book 1, we have all the spectacle and glamour of the reality TV show. Then the second half has all the blood and murder of the games themselves. These 2 halves of the book juxtapose so nicely. It doesn't feel like a sharp tonal shift either. There's always the thin veneer of civilization that threatens to collapse. Something I noticed while rereading this series is that Katniss is always being watched. Throughout the whole trilogy, she has to watch what she says in case someone is listening in. It's the real sense of paranoia that adds such tension to even the mundane scenes. The Capitol or Big Brother is always listening. But this means that there are multiple layers of meaning to every scene. Katniss can't just fight someone in the games, she has to do it in a way that earns her favor. Then later, she can't just have a relationship with the boy like any regular person. It has to be romantic because that's what the people want. That clear expectation means that every action has greater consequences. It's a brilliant way to raise the stakes. At first, this story is about Katniss just trying to survive in this dystopia, but eventually it becomes about trying to change it. This is another thing I noticed while rereading the series, and I'm so glad I did it for this video. For most of book 1, Katniss does not care about social justice. She doesn't want to change the world, she just wants to live. There are several other characters, like Peter for example, who tries to talk to her about anti-capital sentiment, but she shuts them down because she's not interested. Yet it's Rue, that young girl, who causes Katniss to finally radicalize. It's only at this point in the series where she actively starts to hate the Capitol, and that's where we see the berries scene. Yet even going into the second book, the evil President Snow asks her to use her publicity to keep the peace, and she genuinely tries to cooperate. Even now, she doesn't want riots against the Capitol. She still just wants herself and her family to survive. She is only determined to fight back after Gale's whipping scene. This plotline is very subtle, but it shapes the entire story. Katniss changes goals from survival to freedom fighter. And even then, she's not a noble hero standing up for freedom. She's full of rage and hatred and just wants to kill Snow and get revenge. I appreciate the depiction of a very messy hero. As for the romantic plotline, well, that is its own beast. People got so sick of the love triangle trope around this time. It was popularized a few years earlier with Twilight and has kind of been around ever since and refuses to die. But it bloody well works in Hunger Games. Here's why. For one, in Twilight, the options are werewolf or vampire. The characters themselves have completely identical personalities. It's not really much of a choice. But in Hunger Games, we have Peter, who is kind, well-spoken, and empathetic. And then we have Gale, who's grumpy, driven, and eager to fight. They are very different people. Another reason in Twilight, which I'm gonna just lay into a little bit today, Bella's whole story is focused on who she loves. Katniss has a lot more going on in her life. To put it simply, the love triangle in Twilight is the main plot, where it's the subplot of Hunger Games. Subplot is much better. The biggest reason why the love triangle works is the choice needs to have consequences beyond the romantic. So in Twilight, it's Jacob or Edward. The consequences are, Jacob represents Bella's desire to stay human. Edward means becoming a vampire. But that's also all it represents for all 4 books. In the Hunger Games, these 2 love interests represent something more for Katniss, and that changes several times. In fact, let's look at what these 2 characters represent in each book, and in advance, just forgive me, I got really into classifying this and went way overboard. Also, slight spoilers for this area. In book 1, Peter represents the Hunger Games, the battle itself, and the performance. Gale represents home and the family left behind. Then it changes. In the first half of book 2, Peter represents pleasing the Capitol and the never-ending performance as love interests, where Gale represents a new life and a possible escape from that. Then in the second half of book 2, they get called back into the games. Gale now represents the life she could never have, and Peter represents her goal for rebellion to help him survive so he can use his voice to take down the Capitol. And going on, in book 3, Peter is now spokesman for the Capitol, so he represents going back to the way things were, where Gale, who wants to fight back, represents a chance for change. And then when Katniss begins her final mission, Peter represents what she's lost, and Gale represents her desire for revenge. And then after the dust settles, Gale represents the wounds of war, and Peter represents a desire to heal. Anyway, I know I explained the crap out of that, but this just stood out to me so much during the reread, the dynamic and shifting of back and forth of what these characters mean at different stages in the story. Now there's one last reason why the romance works here. Simply put, Katniss is not interested in the romance. Peter mentions that he loves Katniss on the TV show. Katniss agrees to play along for the sake of the games, yet it's only towards the end that she realizes Peter was never playing. It was all real for him. It very much surprises and confuses her. In the same way in book 2, she takes Gale out of the district to go on a hunt, and there she suggests, let's run away and escape the Capitol, and Gale kisses her. it surprises her again. All through books 2 and 3, both guys make a move on her again, and she turns them down. Katniss is focused on the main plot. It's only at the very end of the story, once all the conflict is over, that she turns her attention to romance. The idea of our protagonist being an unwitting object of affection is far more appealing in this situation. Could you imagine if Katniss was busy chasing boys in the middle of this uprising? It would have been uncomfortable to watch. But she's not a silly girl chasing boys. Instead, she's simply trying to protect the people in her life. And it's them and their affection that is driving the romantic plot. All that to say, that's why the romance works. The Hunger Games films are genuinely fantastic. The first two films achieved massive critical acclaim. Mockingjay was split in two, and it led to it having a lower box office take and lower critic score for both films. But overall, these movies are top quality. I've always loved these films for being one of the most accurate book-to-film adaptations I've ever seen. And you know why? Suzanne Collins used her 19 years of TV writing to co-write the adaptation for these films. Except for the second one, but that is one way to keep it faithful.
Fine. I'll do it myself.
Yet here's the unexpected problem. If the adaptation is so faithful to the books, then why even bother reading the books, right? Normally we say, read the books because it includes details that the movie skipped. But in this case, the movies actually include more details. So the books are entirely from Katniss's perspective. The movies add whole plot lines around the game makers, President Snow, and behind the scenes for the games. There's more happening in these films. So why read the books? Well, let's ask the author herself. Okay, not literally, but, quoting her. She said, "When we read, we engage one-on-one with the story. No one interprets it for us." And that's the point. This is a dystopian story about how everything we see on television is telling us what to think. But when we read books, we are unsupervised. We interpret meaning for ourselves. We engage thinking, reasoning, and questioning, and in doing so, fortify our minds from outside control. Books are like tinfoil hats that actually work. So in reading the books, you learn better the true meaning of the story, of thinking about and questioning the information you're being given. But there is one other big reason why you should read the books. Oh my god, this is so true. See, films and books are two very different formats for storytelling. Because films are visual by nature, any sort of violence is more confronting. Books by their nature can allude to stuff without being too graphic. Yet so much of what the books allude to were cut for the film, because there was no way to avoid the stark reality that film would show. Let me break down some of those darker differences, looking at just the first book and slight spoilers for book 1 here. The first big difference in the books, everyone is hungry. Katniss frequently sees signs of malnourishment in the districts and faces starvation herself. Yet everyone in the films is clearly well-fed and healthy. Look at this scene where Katniss is collapsing from starvation and exhaustion. She still looks relatively healthy. Katniss also does not have body autonomy in the books. After she volunteers as tribute, the makeup team immediately strip her naked and inspect her like a prized cow. It's dehumanizing, and it's implied that this happens to all tributes, even the 12-year-olds. And after the Hunger Games, when Katniss has lost so much weight from the hunger during the games, she has to wear padded clothes for her final TV appearance to hide her skinny figure. When she complains about it, Haymitch tells her she should be grateful because they actually wanted to perform surgery against her will to physically alter her appearance, to make her more visually appealing and hide the scars. The biggest difference, all the actors in the film were aged up. A lot. Again, I went down a rabbit hole for this one, sorry in advance. Katniss is 16 in the first book. Now, Jennifer Lawrence, the amazing actress and wonderful human being altogether, was 20 at the time of filming. Peter is also 16, but Josh Hutcherson was 18. If you want to see what Peter would look like at 16, watch Journey to the Center of the Earth. That's the real babyface Peter you would see in the Hunger Games. And look at these 4 career tributes. This is their age in the books, and yet this is the actor's age at the time of filming. It's a pretty big difference. Except for the girl who plays Clove, I think she's literally the only one I could find who was the correct age. I think worst of all is Rue. Her death as a 12-year-old is the most tragic part of the story, yet the actress was again aged up to 14. Imagine her before the growth spurt. Not to mention Rue's death. In the movie, a guy throws a spear at Katniss, so it hits Rue by accident. In the book, Katniss walks in and witnesses this guy holding the spear in two hands and deliberately ramming it into the child's stomach. It's much more intentional and savage. Another dark detail is the stage show with Caesar Flickerman. In the film, Glimmer wears this pink girly outfit. In the books, her outfit is completely see-through. Katniss only sees this and feels intimidated by the girl's sex appeal. But it's a sad implication that this 17-year-old is forced to sexualize herself in order to survive. This is what we call coerced consent. Speaking of the Capitol, in the films, they all just have weird hairstyles. But in the book, the majority of Capitol people have extreme levels of plastic surgery that are obvious at a glance. It further heightens the difference of opulence within the Capitol and scarcity in the districts. The only major area where the films are darker than the books is the start of the Hunger Games. In the books, Katniss grabs one backpack, has a brief scuffle with Clove, and then just yeets herself out of there. Only later does she find out that 13 tributes died. In the movie, this scene is chilling, brutal perfection. It's bloody and violent. It's a massacre. It's also a masterclass in cinematography. Significantly darker than the book. But it's kind of the only area where the film outshines the book here. Okay, so the films are darker. What's the big deal? Why is that incentive to read it? Because books can discuss topics that are taboo on film. It can get away with more. And therefore, it gives you, the reader, more to think about. It can also do this without being too confronting or too upsetting. It's a safe environment to explore mature ideas. Okay, let's finally discuss the prequel. Is it worth reading, or is it just a cash grab? Well, I found it to be surprisingly good. Suzanne Collins is as talented as ever, and this is just as dark and dystopian as the wider series. The story is beautifully tragic. The Hunger Games had started 10 years before this point, but no one is watching it. They just chuck random kids into arena and watch them die. Young Coriolanus Snow, the evil president from the later trilogy, is among several students who are hired to mentor the tributes. Their job is to make the games more appealing in any way possible to make more people watch it. It's a sick challenge to turn government propaganda into sport and entertainment, but it's a clever concept to see unfold, even if we kind of know what direction it's going in eventually. Snow as the main character is just as calloused and evil as ever. I love that Suzanne Collins didn't suddenly make him a nice guy now that he's the main character. Yes, he is different to who he was, 68 years later. He's not President Snow just yet, but he is openly prejudiced and scornful of the people in the districts, and dehumanizes them when he can. Props to the author for just letting him be a villain. Personally, I'm a bit tired of giving villains redemptive qualities. Let them be evil. Snow mentors Lucy Gray. She's the girl tribute from District 12. And yes, there is romantic tension from the start. Lucy is a bard and a street performer. She sings and tells stories, and in many ways she is the entertainment factor that leads Snow in the right direction. They work together to survive. Yet, can there ever be any hope for two people from such different worlds to be together? All that said, the prequel has a much lower Goodreads score than the other books in the series. I was curious about this when I was reading it, and I have to conclude there are two big things that hold this book down. One is that the book adds almost nothing to the greater Hunger Games story. The book is too self-contained. It reminds me of Solo, a Star Wars story. It's a prequel that added nothing new to the main story, and therefore felt entirely predictable and felt pointless. The prequel here is a good story on its own, but as part of a series, it left me wanting more, and not in a good way. And the second thing holding it back, it's just a prequel. Meaning we know where it goes from here. It's hard for prequels to genuinely convince us that something big and significant might happen. The story is never at great risk of doing something unexpected. And it suffers for that, which is a shame because the good parts of this story are going to stay with me for a long time. At the time of the Hunger Games release, YA was emerging in popularity. It's been around since the 60s, and it started becoming very popular because of Harry Potter. Yet it was Hunger Games that truly solidified this genre as legitimate fiction. This made people start to take YA seriously. This series proved that YA could tackle mature content, discuss real issues, and write top-quality stories. It also showed teenagers that they can be heroes, that they have a role to play in the world, and that they can make a difference. It's a story of empowerment, Katniss Everdeen is almost never saved by an adult. She's never held back because she's a child. This is a series that talks to young people like they are competent and intelligent people. Unfortunately, I think the industry just saw dollar signs. A lot of YA content since has copied what the Hunger Games did and not really understood why it worked for the Hunger Games. These copycat books are often too shallow, and most of the time they don't understand the real-world issues well enough to offer commentary on them. They don't have Suzanne Collins' 19 years of TV writing when they try to commentate about TV. It's like they're just trying to be edgy. So while I openly acknowledge that there is some dodgy YA content out there, we also have top-quality fiction as well. The Hunger Games is proof that YA can include some of the greatest stories of them all. Well, for one, these books are short. It won't take much work to read them. I mean, that's incentive, right? Sometimes you don't want to do all the work of reading, but these are not much work. I also think that the dystopian elements of the TV messaging is more relevant than ever. We have multiple news companies that will report conflicting facts about the same event. We have journalistic malpractice, we have biased reporting, and government interference. We should be asking the same questions today as the Hunger Games first made us ask 15 years ago. Also, if you've read this series before in the past, it's worth reading again. The series is insanely deep and layered in meaning. You will notice things that you never noticed before, and it will leave you pondering these ideas for hours and days after. Finally, it's worth reading because Katniss Everdeen is a damn good protagonist. I didn't do a character segment in this video, but let's just all take a moment to appreciate the brilliance that is Suzanne Collins' character writing. Katniss is exactly what a good protagonist should be. She's relatable, sympathetic, but flawed. She's the big sister who cares for her family, she knows how to fight without being bloodthirsty or just argumentative, she knows when she's out of depth and needs help, and she's a total mess by the end of the series. She's allowed to be a real person, and for that, Katniss Everdeen is the best thing about an already great series. Well, that's all from me. I hope I have enticed you to try this series again, or for the first time. Good luck, my friends, and happy reading. Next week, I'm continuing our theme of YA January with Skyward by Brandon Sanderson, and then finishing off the month with the Lunar Chronicles by Marissa Meyer. I hope to see you for those videos. If you liked this video, please comment your thoughts below and subscribe, it really helps the channel. And if you loved this video, please consider supporting me on Patreon, where I post exclusive content, book reviews, and pictures of my cats. I love you guys, and I hope you all enjoy a good book today. Bye! Oh, and in case you're asking, here's another shot of my hair. Yeah, right? How good is it? Yeah.